Let's talk to another man that's going to talk about a positive subject, 19th century funerals here in Ipswich. Harold the H. Peacock is our historian. How are you, Harold?
Very well, Danny. Yes, look, I was motivated to look at the old funerals here in Ipswich because it's been Royal Funeral Week, so I just thought it was worthwhile looking back at some of the great ones.
How good was that funeral?
It was I found it really moving because how was that beat of that drum? Boom, 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 and everyone swaying and something. Even the horses were marching.
Well, when they were marching, this is how it sounded. Parade, stand at ease. Parade, attention. How'd I go?
Oh, pretty good, but it was very moving, even with your interpretation. It was still very moving.
Now, tell us about these funerals in Ipswich.
Yeah, look, the first of the really big funerals in Ipswich was in 1864 for Thomas de Lacy Moffat. He was an Irishman. He was one of the first big-time graziers on the Darling Downs. He ran his empire from here in Ipswich, which back in the 19th century was known as having the highest rate of horse ownership in the colonies. Now, Moffat was elected to the first Queensland Parliament and became colonial treasurer. His time in office was not particularly noteworthy, although while he was treasurer, there was a slight problem with the auditing process. And political opponents said of Moffat, whatever his principles may be, they gave him little trouble.
Wow.
But on the day of the funeral in Ipswich in 1864, all the banks, shops and government offices were closed. Almost all of the inhabitants of Ipswich came to pay their last respects.
Wow.
The funeral was held in St Paul's Church, which at the time was the biggest church in Queensland. Inside, it was about three-quarters full, but outside, more than double that number waited. They were all on horseback and couldn't come inside. It would have been an incredible spectacle. Anyway, the most spectacular funeral of the 19th century was in 1890 for George Elms. He was a 33-year-old blacksmith. He died from tetanus after one night he collided with a buggy while he was racing home on his horse. Elms was a member of the Queensland Scottish Rifles, and the men of his company resolved to pay their respects in a most befitting manner, I think. On the day of his funeral, all the military of the district and beyond assembled at the Ipswich drill shed. From there, they paraded through the streets of Ipswich and attracted a huge amount of attention from everyone, of course. The parade was led by the Westmoreton Field Battery, followed by the Moreton Regiment, the Queensland Scottish Rifles, the Queensland Irish Rifles, and the Cadets. It was a long parade, and they marched silently without music to Elms's residence at Newtown. That's right, exactly that march, those boots on the road. And it was at Newtown, that's where the Queensland Scottish formed an escort and presented arms as the coffin was brought out of his home. Now, the cortege was then led by bagpipes, and once at the Ipswich Cemetery, the Queensland Scottish fired a salute of 3 volleys. Now, it was without doubt the most moving and spectacular funerals ever seen in Ipswich, certainly up to that time. But the longest funeral in Ipswich was in June 1900 for the Mayor of Ipswich, Peter Brown. He'd been in the council for 26 years. He'd been the mayor 5 times, and still is one of only 2 mayors to have died in office. Now, the cortege was the longest ever seen in the history of Ipswich. Mounted police rode at the head of the procession. The cortege that followed was over a mile long. As the first part reached the cemetery gates, the last of the carriages were still back in town on Warwick Street, opposite the hospital. There were 154 horse-drawn vehicles following the hearse, and the line of people following that was even longer. And at the cemetery, there was an unprecedented 65 wreaths that were placed in the coffin. So the coffin was just buried in flowers.
Wow, that's a lot of wreaths.
It is, but the last one I'll tell you about is a little bit different from that. It's the most unusual funeral to end the 19th century and was held just a few months later in September 1900. It was for James Stewart of Limestone Street in Ipswich.
James?
James died from typhoid fever, and he was very well known and respected in business circles here in town. He was a member of the Ipswich Amateur Cycling Club, and what made his funeral usual was that it was the first cyclist's funeral ever seen in Ipswich.
Wow.
And what that means is, in a lengthy procession through Ipswich, his clubmates walked in silence with their bicycles all draped in black. Mm-hmm. Now, there wasn't a huge number of wreaths like there had been for the mayor 3 months earlier, but the Queensland Times noted something unusual in that there was a very nice artificial one from the employees of the Queensland Woolen Manufacturing Company. So the scene was really unique for the time and never seen before in Ipswich. So, Daddy, like I said, this Royal Funeral Week, I thought it was worth noting these 4 special funerals from the history of Ipswich, 120 plus years ago.
Damien, is he the best storyteller on the planet?
Absolutely had me. That's why I was a bit late coming back on.
Drags us in,
I know, because I was
dragged us in, and then bang, straight on the goober.
Word.
He just hits you straight on the point of the chin.
Yep.
He is the best. Harold the H. Hark, hark, hark. Peacock. How do we get to read about this and other history stories about Ipswich?
Yes, I'll upload this story first thing tomorrow morning on historyoutThere.com. And I've got about 300 short stories there, many of them about Ipswich. HistoryoutThere.com.
And get on there and tell us how much you enjoyed this segment on West Bremer Radio. And as we go out, we march out at 8:21. Parade! Right, dress.